The notion of a repeating block of code, or in other words a loop, is fundamental to just about every programming language. The Bourne shell does indeed support loops. In fact, it offers two different types of loops, what we call the while loop and the for loop. If you've ever programmed before in another programming language, say for example C, then you'll be very familiar with the notion of a while loop, and you'll probably be also familiar with the notion of a for loop, but the way the Bourne shell implements the for loop is actually somewhat different to what you might be used to. So if you were planning to skip over this chapter because you already know loops very well, I wouldn't skip over the module on the for loop. It is a little different to what you might expect. Also in this chapter we discuss the notion of arithmetic. We find out the way in which we can actually implement arithmetic using the shell. That's in the module on EXPR. Anyway, let's begin. We'll start with the while loop. If you're very comfortable with the if statement and the way it conditionally executes a block of code, then you'll probably be fairly comfortable with the while loop. It's very similar to the if statement. It actually just simply repeats the execution of a block of code in the same way that the if statement conditionally executes the block of code, in other words, based on the exit status of one command at the top of the loop. And it looks like this. We start with the line while command, and that actually means while this command continues to return an exit status of 0, in other words true, then do the following. We have the word do on the next line, on a line by itself, and then we have the code block, which can of course be as many lines of code as you like, followed by the word done, which is a little inconsistent from the if statement, which actually just reverses the word if and calls it phi, in the same way case becomes esac and so forth. And as I said before, the code block just simply executes repeatedly until the command at the top returns an exit status that is non-zero. Let's have a look at a little example of that. You might use the while loop to read an answer from the keyboard and keep reading the answer until they answer something that is valid. Or in other words, while they continue to answer an invalid answer, you get them to try again. So here we might read an answer, and then we use the test program to test whether the answer that they entered happens to be equal to the correct answer, which might in this case be chickens. And if it's not, then we can execute a code block which would echo out some kind of error message and ask them to do it again. I'll show you another example now. I'll demonstrate an example that's perhaps a little bit more useful. Here's a very simple implementation of the while loop that can be used to make sure that the user actually entered a valid directory name when a directory was required. You simply ask them to enter a directory and then you test it using of course the test program, the open square bracket, and if it is not a directory, then you can print out an error message to that effect and ask them to enter that again, and that will keep going around and around and around and around in that loop until such time as they enter a valid directory name, at which point it will drop out to the bottom and echo out the word congratulations. Now, the block of code between the do and the done may never get executed because the directory that they enter the very first time may actually be a directory. So let's have a look at that running. I'll run that now. Please enter the name of a directory. Well, I'll just type in some garbage there. Okay, that's not a directory. Please try again. And if I just press enter by itself, okay, so that's empty is not a directory. Please try again. I'll just type in /temp, and that is a directory. So that is clearly working. So there's really not much to the while loop. It's quite simple. If you understand the if statement, then you probably understand the while loop. It's actually simpler than the if statement because it doesn't have an else clause or an elif or anything like that. But there is actually one interesting, shall we say, advanced thing that you can do with the while loop, which I'll just show you now because it is very, very useful at times. It's actually possible to get a while loop to process each line of the output of a given command. In other words, to execute the code block once for each line of the output of the command. Let's have a look at an example of that. The command in this case might be the who command. So you can actually take the output of a program, like who, and pipe it to a while loop as long as the condition that you're testing in the while loop is actually a read statement. The read statement will continue to read one line at a time from the output of the Who program until it reaches the end of the output, at which time it will return false. Now the data in the Who program is comprised of 3 columns: the username, the terminal they're on, and the time that they logged in. So I can read the data from that line into 3 different variables: user, term, and time, and then I can simply echo that out. User has been on term since time, or I can process that in any way that I like. That is an extremely useful construct. It's a little bit difficult to get the syntax right and to remember how it goes, but if you can refer back to this, it's very, very useful. Okay, so that's it for the while loop. Pretty straightforward stuff.